Good morning, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get us started here. I am Kelly Bourne, Director of the Cyber Initiative at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and I'm glad to be continuing to co-host these monthly webinars in collaboration with colleagues at the Stanford Cyber Policy Center, where I remain as an affiliate. So thanks, everyone, for joining today. We're going to be discussing digital resilience, connectivity, and governance in the Indo-Pacific region. And this is a particularly important region to discuss because it remains home to more than half of the world's internet users. And the countries that we're going to be focusing on today, 7 countries outlined in this report: India, Australia, Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam, collectively account for more than 1 billion people online. And the size of the digital economies in this region stands at nearly $400 billion. The pandemic, I think, for this region, as with so many others, has really underscored our reliance on digital technologies and has inspired many countries, including countries in the Indo-Pacific, to start thinking more about the fragility of these global technology flows and how best to protect themselves. So the research here, I think, is really interesting to cover, and we're glad to be joined by 2 great experts: Trisha Ray, who is from India's Observer Research Foundation, which is by many metrics amongst the top 5 think tanks in the world. And Trisha Ray joins as part of the Technology and Media Initiative there, and her research has covered a wide range of topics in the tech space, everything from the security implications of emerging technologies to AI norms and governance to governance of lethal autonomous weapons. Trisha is also a member of UNESCO's Information Accessibility Working Group and was one of the main authors on the report that we're discussing today. And then we're joined also by Martijn Rasser from the Center for New American Security. He is a senior fellow in the Tech and National Security program there. And prior to joining CNAS, he was a senior intelligence official and analyst in the CIA, where he worked on foreign emerging technologies, tech innovation, and weapons research and development. Prior to that, he was a senior advisor in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. So really glad to have both of you joining us. Before we jump into the conversation, just a couple of points of background that I think are worth noting. In the last few years, we have seen, in particular in the Indo-Pacific, a real shift or trend towards regionalization and localization in the supply chain for digital technologies, and part driven by concerns about decades of globalization that had preceded that and the real reliance on China that underscored. And so to address this, we've seen in these countries a real increase in investment in R&D and tech capacity building, and a real growth in the startup sector as well. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the Indo-Pacific region is now home to 55,000 startups, more than 70% of which are based in India, which is now the world's 3rd largest startup ecosystem. So a lot happening in the world of digital technologies in these economies. This report looks at the 7 countries that I mentioned before and does really a fantastic job of comparing and contrasting the status of each of these countries around close to, I think, a dozen dimensions. I'll highlight a couple of them here that I thought were really interesting. It looks at the reliance on China for rare earth elements, which of course are really critical supplies in almost any technology that is being developed. It looks at the status of foundational infrastructure in each of these countries: electricity supply, telecommunications networks, investment in undersea cables and broadband. It looks at the status of digital literacy and education in these countries, at challenges with tech manufacturing, particularly when it comes to really critical semiconductor chips, especially as the supply chain has started to move out of China as wages have been rising there, and in light of the Trump US-China trade wars. It looks at the key role of digital financial services, and in particular, digital payments, especially in driving financial inclusion, given that something like 70% of Vietnam and Cambodia's population and 50% of Indonesia's populations remain unbanked. And then finally, it looks at questions around digital governance and localization, which we have all seen have been extremely contentious in recent years, and questions around digital ID, which are now present in India and Singapore, and which have sparked many questions and concerns about potential human rights issues. So a lot to cover. I'm really glad to have Trisha and Martin here to join us. Trisha, I wanted to start with you and hear a little bit about the origins of the report and what you saw as the key sort of highlights or priorities here. Then wanted to turn, Martin, to you for your reactions, and I'll go back and forth with a few questions I had for each of you before opening it up for a Q&A with the audience, probably in about 20 or 30 minutes. So for those joining us, there's a chat box. Please enter any of your questions there, and you can upvote those for ones that you're particularly interested in, and I will do my best to moderate that. So Trisha, over to you, and thank you again.
Thank you, Kelly, for that kind introduction and for allowing me to present the research that my team and I have been working on as part of this project. So to answer your question, the Indo-Pacific construct is a traditionally hard security-focused concept, and it was linked with China's expansion into the South China Sea and its growing maritime footprint in the Indian and Pacific Oceans, as well as what that could mean for freedom of navigation and then maritime choke points like the Malacca Strait. But the construct has since evolved beyond its maritime security roots, and it now captures numerous interpretations of countries within as well as outside its geographic bounds. So it captures issues like sustainable development, trade, infrastructure, and now increasingly cooperation on critical and emerging technologies. And it is this big tent definition that has also brought together the four unlikely partners that are the Quad: US, India, Japan, and Australia, and then has eventually led also to this Quad Tech Network, which is this Track 2 initiative, of which Martin and CNAS are a part, and ORF is also a part. So my team and I captured this evolution of the Indo-Pacific in our paper that you mentioned, the Digital Indo-Pacific, Regional Connectivity and Resilience. And the second part of this title, Regional Connectivity and Resilience, was quite difficult to conceptualize because it is an interplay of four interacting layers. At an individual level, it's about inclusive digital transformation, about the ability of individuals from all socioeconomic backgrounds to participate in the digital economy. And that includes issues like skilling, for example. At a national level, it's about industrial and economic growth, about regulations, basic infrastructure like electricity and stable internet. And then at a regional level, it's about how this panoply of, say, digital regulations in data and cybersecurity interact with each other. Then also about complementarities within the region in terms of tech manufacturing or critical components. And then finally, all of these layers interact with this broader global context of strategic competition between China and the United States, especially in tech. And so with this context, we settled upon our four-layer framework in the paper, which includes hardware, so tech manufacturing, in which we looked at rare earths and semiconductors specifically. It's about inclusive digital transformation, digital adoption and the digital economy, so strength of innovation. And then finally, regimes, the laws and policies that, that support the digital ecosystem. And so this paper, as well as the other three in the Quad Tech series, including Martin's brilliant paper on techno-democratic statecraft, are essentially a tasting menu of issues and ideas that the Quad and the region as a whole can cooperate on.
Trisha, thanks so much. That overview was really helpful, and I particularly appreciate your characterization of the four different levels at which this is relevant. I think it really underscores the complexity of the issues that you're grappling with. Martin, would love to hear your reactions on this, and then after that, Trisha, would love to turn to you for, at the end of the report, there's a whole series of recommendations, and would be curious if one or two of those were sort of most salient for you, in particular, if you have thoughts on the supply chains, I think, and what that really means to be trusted supply chains, but really any of the top recommendations that stand out. But Martin, first to you on your reactions here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Kelly. Great to be here with you and with Trisha. So as Trisha mentioned, so we're part of this Quad Tech network. Want to share a bit more background with you on that. So it's an Australian-led initiative, Track 2 dialogue. So think tanks and academic institutions to really think through just opportunities for the Indo-Pacific in this whole range. And the paper that Trisha and her colleagues wrote, I think, is fantastic. So I highly recommend that everyone listening today read it. There's some really interesting recommendations in there, and I know you just asked Trisha to touch on some of these, but there was one in particular that I found very intriguing, which I wanted to highlight, because I really think this is a standout idea. It's this establishment of what Trisha calls a Chrome network, which I really like. It's built on the premise of the Blue Dot network, which is a sustainable infrastructure that sets baseline standards for how you can construct sustainable and secure, resilient infrastructure. But this would apply it to digital infrastructure. And I think this holds a lot of premise, because based on the research that I've done, I really see this as being a sweet spot where like-minded countries can really work together effectively and promote sustainable digital infrastructure throughout the Indo-Pacific. And this is really important given how Beijing in particular is promoting its own version of digital infrastructure that really isn't compatible with liberal democratic values. And I think it's important that the tech leading democracies of the world provide a true viable alternative to these types of investments that China is promoting. Indo-Pacific being ground zero for this. I'll echo also the importance of supply chain restructuring, rare earth elements. This is an area that is very much ripe for near-term action by countries in the Indo-Pacific. It's a well understood problem. It's well defined. And so there's very meaningful change that can and should happen in relatively short order if you consider how critically dependent we are on China for these critical materials, and how important these materials are to green energy and a whole range of electronic devices that we depend on just for the day-to-day functioning of our society. So that's a dependence that we need to address. I also, just in general, really recommend the range of recommendations that Trisha put forward on digital development and the digital economy. There's a lot of thought that Trisha and her team put into these, and I think there's some great starting points for meaningful dialogue within the Indo-Pacific and beyond.
Martin, thanks for that. And a quick follow-on question before turning to Trisha, which is on the Chrome network, can you, or I suppose Trisha, provide a concrete example of what this would look like? And so my understanding is that this would be a certification of individuals, of entities, or of countries that sort of meet baseline standards when it comes to tech products or services. But what would a specific example of a certification, say, of an individual or a country look like?
Well, I think I should let Trisha answer that first, but then I'll share my thoughts on what I think something like that could look like.
Perfect. Yeah, Trisha, would love to turn to you both to answer that, and then also just of all the recommendations you put forth, which ones you felt most strongly about.
So the idea with the Chrome certification is to precisely capture all these 4 layers that we've mentioned in the papers. So that there are the necessary legal regimes in place, that there are necessary precautions in terms of supply chain security being taken, and then also including other metrics like environment, like sustainable supply chain. So we'd have a range of parameters, and that's how we would go about this Chrome Dot certification. It's still an idea that we're building out. This is essentially a teaser for the phase 2 and phase 3 projects that we'll be undertaking in the Quad Tech network. Moving on to some specific recommendations from the paper. Martin has already mentioned the one we had for supply chains. The recommendations fall under 3 broad themes. So one is the supply chains. The second is modifying existing partnerships to adapt to the world that's changing around us. And the resurgence of the Quad with its broader bucket of issues is an example of repurposing an existing partnership. And then the third theme is forming new coalitions of like-minded actors with specific narrow goals. So an example of that would be like issue-focused coalitions like the D10, which focuses, or the proposed D10, which would focus on 5G. There are 10 specific recommendations in the paper, but I'll highlight a few. One is there's a need for data governance track 1.5s because there are numerous data governance frameworks arising in the region, including India's Personal Data Protection Bill, and how these will interact and what the implications will be for digital economies and the regional digital space still needs deliberation. We also make several recommendations on first order issues. The availability of basic services like electricity, high-speed internet are still very patchy in the region. And then even issues like digital literacy need to be highlighted. And then in technology manufacture, Southeast Asia and India are home to a lot of, in the case of semiconductors, fabrication facilities, but they lack the design capacity. And so there is a need for essentially building that specific capacity because manufacturing capacity exists, but the design capacity does not. And then in digital economy, for example, we recommended that we need some common standards for digital services at a national and then a regional level, and digital payments can serve as a starting point in that area.
Thanks, Trisha. That's really helpful. Martin, wanted to turn back to you because you've worked on so many different aspects of this to think about where the real areas are for common ground here in the region for some kind of tech policy collaboration.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Trisha mentioned one area that I think holds a lot of promise, and that would be 5G telecommunications infrastructure. So there's, of course, the whole Huawei issue, the Chinese telecommunications company that is the manufacturer of a lot of the radio access network equipment that you need in order to build out a 5G network. Huawei has been quite successful at making inroads into the Indo-Pacific with its equipment, but that comes with a lot of security risks and security concerns, something that particularly under the Trump administration, the United States became increasingly vocal about. But really, it was Australia that was very much at the forefront of warning people about the risks of having an untrusted vendor such as Huawei on these networks. Unlike with our current 4G networks, with 5G networks, it essentially becomes impossible to mitigate or isolate the risk factor of having an untrusted vendor on your network, just because of the nature of the network, where the distinction between the core and the edge of the network disappears. So one of the things that I think holds a lot of promise, particularly if it's driven by the Quad, is to provide sustainable and secure alternatives to Huawei. And this could come under the guise of this Chrome.network, right? Because now you have a group of like-minded countries with considerable capabilities in telecommunications infrastructure that could work together, provide financing, provide technological solutions, particularly if you start focusing on some alternatives such as open radio access networks. And this means largely taking on the functionality of the proprietary hardware with software. This introduces vendor diversity. And I think in particular, a country like India would become quite a big player in this, given their strong software development capabilities. Using the Quad to promote these types of technologies then could serve as a proof of concept for a broader Democracy 10, what Trisha mentioned, right? Some type of tech alliance, a grouping of like-minded countries that seek to promote real alternatives to some of the Chinese technological offerings. And that then could, I think, provide a really interesting foundation for much more enhanced cooperation throughout the Indo-Pacific region. That ultimately is what the Quad in particular should start moving towards. Right now, there's a lot of so-called swing states, right, in the Indo-Pacific, so countries that are on the bubble of democracy and autocracy. And which way those swing states will go over the course of the next decade will in large part determine what type of global vision ends up predominating in the 21st century. Is it a global vision where you have the rule of law, you have adherence to liberal democratic values, or will it become more so of one that comports with the Chinese autocratic vision? So that's why I see this very much as a microcosm of a lot of the broader issues that we've been talking so much about the past couple of years.
Yeah, Martin, I think that's exactly right, that these questions about how these technologies are governed are going to have huge implications for how democratic or autocratic the whole global ecosystem looks going forward. Trisha, I want to turn to you for a second to hear your thoughts more on the role of the Quad here. But first wanted to highlight that the report I think does a really nice job in particular of looking at this 5G issue. And I think there's a really thoughtful table in there that looks at each of these countries, whether or not they've deployed 5G. I think only Australia and Singapore had to date, whether or not they were banning Huawei as Australia did, but others have mostly, it looks like, allowed for trials, whether there are indigenous alternatives to Huawei for 5G, which I think only India and Vietnam had. And so I think you do a really nice job of looking at where all of the countries sort of fall in their adoption of 5G and stance towards Huawei. But yeah, Trisha, would love to hear your thoughts on the role of the Quad overall and thinking about governance in this region. For those who aren't as familiar with the Quad, I think this was started in 2007 by Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, and Dick Cheney was heavily involved, as I understand at the time. And as you had mentioned, Trisha, this is a strategic dialogue between the US, Japan, Australia, and India. So would love to hear your thoughts on the role of the Quad. Martin, then would love to turn to you for thoughts, and Trisha will come back to you on this also, on just the greatest opportunities or risks that you see in the region going forward. And then I imagine that'll get us back to time. So would love for those in the audience to go ahead and start entering any questions that you might have in the Q&A box. So Trisha, to you on the role of the Quad, and then to both of you on risks and opportunities.
So the Quad's common mission has been support for a rules-based order and support for a free, open, inclusive, and resilient Indo-Pacific. And then, of course, they're united by certain democratic values. A contention that often comes up is that the practice of these values is often very different, not just amongst the Quad, but amongst democracies in general. And that's because the growth and the current flavor of democracy in these countries is interwoven with the social and political context and histories of each country. And it's unlikely that these differences will ever be fully resolved, but this small thread of like-mindedness, in the Quad case, it's driven by a common set of goals, a common set of interests, and often a common adversary in the region. And it is this like-mindedness that has brought this unlikely grouping together and initiated dialogue amongst the 4 countries, not just between the governments, but also civil society and academia on issues that will impact not just the Quad, but the region and even the world as a whole, which is why the Indo-Pacific increasingly has the support of the EU and France that also want to be part of this grouping. Issues like cybersecurity, governance of AI, digital infrastructure, skilling, even disinformation are areas ripe for Quad cooperation. And it's also this big tent that has helped the Quad grow beyond its initial narrow maritime security mission and now has global buy-in.
Great. Thank you, Trisha. That's really helpful. Martin, thoughts on your biggest concerns or hopes for the region? And then Trisha, I'll turn to you with that, and then we'll turn to Q&A.
Yeah, well, Trisha captured the dynamics of the Quad very well. I think the biggest risk is that the like-minded countries of the Indo-Pacific will do too little too late, particularly when it comes to addressing proliferating high-tech liberalism out of China. This carries very profound consequences. I'll just focus specifically on the implications of this digital entanglement of China with other countries in the region. Just from a U.S. perspective, the way I often think about these issues, it really risks chipping away at U.S. alliances and partnerships, and that, of course, has important implications for the other Quad countries, as well as many other partner countries there, impairing U.S. ability to project force. Think of the consequences for a Taiwan scenario, a South China Sea scenario. It encroaches on American economic sway in the region, and that in and of itself will directly impact the economies of the entire Indo-Pacific. And of course, more broadly, just the erosion of democratic norms and values in the Indo-Pacific. Without a strong U.S. presence, that is going to directly impact the ability of countries like India and Australia and New Zealand and others to protect and safeguard their own democratic values. Ultimately, what I see as the greatest opportunity is, what the Quad is starting to do now is really to craft a cooperative framework across the spectrum. But I do think that technology is very much at the center of this strategic competition, and tech policy, the decisions we make and how we execute those decisions are going to be extremely consequential for how this broader interaction with autocratic regimes in the Indo-Pacific, how that's going to play out. So yes, there are considerable risks, but at the end of the day, I'm very optimistic that these countries will seize on the opportunities that are available. I think the initial signs are very encouraging. How the Quad is coming together to tackle difficult tech policy issues as well as efforts such as Australia, who just released a new cyber and critical technology strategy that's very much aligned with the types of things that we're talking about today. So it's great to see some of the middle powers in the region really stepping up to the plate, pushing the boundaries of the dialogue in ways that I consider to be a very positive direction.
Great. Thank you, Martin. Trisha, would love to hear your thoughts on sort of opportunities and risks. And then if there are questions from the audience, people go ahead and feel free to enter those in the chat box. Otherwise, would love to take up with you both a question on rare earth elements that I have been thinking about. But Trisha, thoughts on risks and opportunities?
So Martin has covered quite a lot, so I'll add my +1 to all the risks and opportunities he spoke about. Just to give an example of how the Quad is making significant moves in the critical tech space, there is now a Quad Critical and Emerging Tech Working Group, and they will be working on 5 specific areas, one being technology supply chains, another being principles on design, development, and use of critical technologies, technology standards, telecommunications, that would include 5G, as well as monitoring trends in emerging technologies, including biotech and quantum. And so the expanding ambit is like a positive sign. The risk is often we are currently still in the testing of waters stage. How far will the principles that the 4 countries have, how far will like-mindedness take us in arriving at specific measures still remains a big question mark, but the political will certainly seems to be there on all sides.
Great. Thank you, Trisha. So now jumping into something rather specific, but as I said, the report covered about a dozen different areas. One of those was looking at rare earth elements. And as I understand it, you had indicated that the consumption of rare earth elements is expected to basically double over the next decade. And I think your report underscores that more than 2/3 of that is happening in China right now, even though they really only account for about 1/4 of total rare earth element reserves, and that Vietnam actually has a pretty significant supply of rare earth element reserves, although they're not really producing much at this time. My understanding is that there are really significant environmental challenges. They're actually not as rare, these elements, as the name might lead one to believe, but that the ability to extract and refine them requires, really significant infrastructure investments, and that doing so in a way that isn't quite environmentally harmful is a challenge. For both of you, how do you see this playing out? What do you think can be done from a policy perspective to support more resilience in this domain? And what are your sort of biggest concerns there?
Do you want to go first, Trisha, or do you want me to go in? Well, so yeah, the rare earths situation is, like I said earlier, right? It's a very acute problem, but fortunately, it's also one where we have a very good understanding both of the problem and what the potential solutions are. And the Indo-Pacific region is very fortunate in that it has all the tools in place to affect meaningful change in this area. So Australia and Vietnam have considerable reserves of rare earths. Japan has been exploring its seabed for materials as well, so there's a potential source. But most importantly, of course, China has a lock on global production capacity right now. So what really needs to happen is a group of countries to cooperate to open up new production facilities, and that takes time, it takes energy, but it also requires a commitment from national governments that these new production facilities if they're run by private industry, do have financial backing, because ultimately you're competing with Chinese industrial policy. And as with other areas such as aluminum, for example, China has shown that it's very effective at manipulating markets in such a way that it can drive out competition if it deems that competition to be a threat to its standing as the dominant producer. So you'd have to have that element behind it. But there also are other things that we can do. Japan, for example, has done some very interesting research on rare earths recycling. So there are ways where you can stretch your supplies by reusing materials that have already been incorporated in finished products. And there's joint R&D efforts that could be done in looking at man-made alternatives to rare earths. So creating synthetic materials that have the same properties and qualities that make rare earths so desirable, particularly for rare earth magnets, for example. So looking a few decades out, what can a group of countries do together to find alternatives to extractive mining in this sense, which of course has a lot of environmental benefits that go along with it as well.
Martin, that was a really helpful answer and made me feel more optimistic about the situation than I have in reading other reports of it. So thank you. I'll now turn to a couple of audience questions, and then depending on how much else we hear from the audience, want to turn to a question of sort of internet penetration rates that I have. But first, we have a question, and I'll just read it verbatim. So the Trump era has highlighted the risks of an unreliable U.S. leadership for middle powers such as Canada or South Korea. And there is discourse of transition from U.S. unipolar or multipolar world in the long run. Finally, as you noted, there are states that do not fully share democratic liberal values in the Indo-Pacific region. In this context, how do you see the Quad network building enough trust to get buy-in from the swing states that are considering long-term pros and cons? So basically, if the U.S. isn't going to be leading on this and the leadership has not been reliable there, what are the alternatives and what is the role of the Quad in that?
Yeah, I can take a first cut at that. I think one of the key things that the Quad would have to do is to show that any initiatives that it proposes and pursues is not tied to the proclivities of any one single national leader, right? Ultimately, you have to assure any partnership with the Quad that the next Japanese prime minister, the next American president won't alter or derail whatever project was already underway. It's going to take some time, particularly, I think, for the United States to rebuild some of that trust and confidence that was lost over the course of the past 4 years. But that's not an insurmountable obstacle. I think by and large, people recognize that what happened in the United States was anomalous and not the norm. But undoubtedly, the Biden administration has its work cut out for them to regain that trust and confidence. As far as working with non-democratic states, what I wrote in my paper for the Quad Tech Network, this concept of techno-democratic statecraft, there has to be a strong element of pragmatism involved, right? Where you don't exclude certain countries because they aren't full-fledged democracies. The key, of course, is to focus on issues where there's a common need for solutions, a common desire for solutions. So you have to be pragmatic in who you work with and how you work with them. You're not going to dictate your values on a country like Vietnam when you're trying to address the rare earths issue, because ultimately you don't want to thwart any constructive cooperative effort simply because a country isn't democratic. There's enough alignment on strategic objectives that you can put that aside for the purposes of achieving things that need to be done.
Thanks, Martin. Trisha, anything you would add to that, or we have some other sort of ongoing questions about the Quad you may have seen?
Yes, I'll add on to that. So the view from India has actually been very different when it comes to the Trump administration, in that a lot of the actions the administration took were very much in line with India's strategic objectives for the region. To the extent that I remember not too long ago, there were a lot of folks in Indian policy and academic circles who were wondering whether Biden would even commit the same effort and energy to the Indo-Pacific as the Trump administration had. And I remember in the early days, folks citing the fact that Biden used the term Asia Pacific instead of Indo-Pacific in his initial speeches as like a big point of controversy here. And then to the second part of that question, so like-mindedness amongst the Quad is in one sense defined in terms of democratic values, but it now captures so many other issue areas and common interests, which I've mentioned in the course of this discussion, including digital infrastructure or skilling or disinformation, that are common interests irrespective of the nature of the regime. And I think that in that sense, like-mindedness would still be ripe grounds for cooperation between the Quad and the broader region.
Great, thanks, Trisha. I now want to turn to a question on the topic of content moderation, and the question that's come in about, this region accounts for half of the world's internet users. Given that massive user base, is there some sway that these countries could have in the behavior of social media platforms like Facebook? Is there any kind of common ground around tech policy cooperation in the region, or any sort of harmonized efforts to come up with a unified stance on that topic?
Do you want to take a first cut at this, Trisha?
Sure. So in terms, the question I think is also about a larger issue rather than just content moderation, which is platform regulation in general and big tech, how we should tackle the question of big tech's influence in general. And different countries have taken different approaches, but more or less you see a gradual shift towards taking the regulatory approach. So this is common amongst all four Quad actors. The US has had several big tech hearings now, antitrust hearings. In India, there have been several antitrust cases brought up against platforms like Facebook and Google. Australia has been in the news recently for its own set of regulations regarding content providers on Google. And so there is, I believe, plenty of alignment on these issues. There's often this conflation of the platform and the government of the country the platform is based in, but really there's more alignment in interests than we give credit.
Yeah, I agree with Trisha on that point. And I think there's going to be some very consequential change on tech governance in the United States in the next year or two. Across the political spectrum, there's considerable frustration and dissatisfaction with big tech, and Democrats and Republicans for different reasons, granted, but they do see a need for some type of regulation. There are still differences, of course, with the European Union in particular on data governance and data privacy. But I think just because of the fact that now so many internet users are not in the United States, that those voices will increasingly be heard. And these countries have considerable opportunity to shape what big tech will look like in coming years. And that's, I think, a discussion that is very much worth having, and one to closely monitor, because it's going to have a considerable impact on how the tech sector develops. And there are important concerns that we need to address on a whole host of data privacy and other tech related issues.
Yeah, I think I'll add that, Modi's government has been particularly interesting to observe in its interaction with social media companies in India, just given how engaged that government is in social media content generation generally. I think I have been extremely skeptical of antitrust as a solution here that's going to address disinformation in particular. While I can imagine it might address some other concerns, I think more of the regulations that we've seen in the space of privacy and potentially legal liability, as we've seen in Germany, and that my sense is that those interventions hold potentially more promise, at least when it comes to this topic of disinformation, than do efforts around antitrust. But it'll be really interesting to see how it plays out in the region. So we have another question here about historical analogs for multilateral cooperation on tech alignment and security, and what can be learned from efforts in the past. Have you guys spent time looking at historical efforts around tech alignment and security? Or has that been outside of the bandwidth of your research?
Yeah, that's been outside of the scope of my work. I've been focused primarily on determining what a blueprint for an alliance framework for tech policy would look like in the current context. So I noticed this question also asked about, how is industry getting involved? So CNAS, in conjunction with MERIX, a think tank in Germany, and the Asia-Pacific Initiative in Japan, we had a track 1.5 initiative where we brought stakeholders from industry, government, and civil society together to talk through what an idea of a Tech 10 or a D10 or a Tech 12, what that would actually look like in practice, really focusing on those nuts and bolts issues of what countries should be members, what is the voting structure, who should represent the governments and the corporations that would be directly involved with the decision making and so forth. That's where my focus has been. I think we made a lot of strides in figuring out how to bring a tech alliance type of organization to fruition. And I'm very encouraged to see that the Biden administration is starting to adopt some of these concepts. And there's interesting legislation in the US Congress putting forward these ideas as well. For example, just yesterday, the US Senate put forward the Strategic Competition Act. In one of the sections of that legislation, there's a proposal to create a technology partnership office within the Department of State. So this office would be mandated to create the types of tech partnerships like we're talking about today. So what is happening bilaterally with Japan, minilaterally with the Quad. So I see these as the initial steps in moving towards a more comprehensive multilateral framework to tackle the very issues that we're talking about, because it will take a group of like-minded countries ultimately, just because these issues, they're global, they're complex, and addressing them, if you consider supply chains, no one country can do that on its own, obviously. If you look at the complexity of semiconductor supply chains, it's going to take a very concerted effort to deal with the expense and the disruption that restructuring those supply chains will cause. So that's why I think ultimately what we need is a true tech alliance of like-minded countries to be able to do this effectively.
Thanks, Martin. And the other thing that I would add, at least with respect to how industry is getting involved, is that it really varies. Looking particularly at the disinformation space, there have been areas where industry has been able to collaborate when it comes to terrorism recruitment, child harm, things like that. And then other areas where there have been concerns that if there is too much industry collaboration, that might be perceived as somehow violating antitrust rules, at least in the United States. So you've seen calls both in the information integrity, but also in other tech areas for there to be carve-outs or other mechanisms to allow better collaboration, both across different industry players, but also between industry and government or industry and the security community. So you saw in the Cyber Solarium report that came out a year or so ago, calls for better information sharing in that respect. You've seen Senator Warner's office in the US and others calling for mechanisms to allow better collaboration there. And for ISACs or other information sharing structures to be introduced. So I think there are some really interesting opportunities there. If there are last questions for the audience, I'll have people go ahead and enter those now. Otherwise, we're just about at time and wanted to turn to Martijn and to Trisha for sort of final thoughts on this topic. And then I will take a moment to turn to next steps from the Cyber Policy Center in terms of upcoming webinars. But last call for questions, and otherwise, Martijn and Trisha would love to turn to you for any final thoughts. I should say final thoughts or previews on what you're going to be working on or researching next. Would be interested in both.
Do you want to go first, Trisha, or do you want me to go ahead?
You can go first. I'll
Okay. Yeah. So just want to, reiterate, obviously we're still very much in the, beginning stages, right, of crafting effective solutions to a lot of the issues that we were talking about today. But that said, I think there's considerable momentum and desire amongst like-minded democracies to really start seriously tackling these issues. I'm personally most excited about the potential for digital infrastructure investment mechanisms that could be a real game changer, not just for the Indo-Pacific, but for Africa and Latin America in particular. As far as my, my personal work goes, I'm continuing to work on the Alliance Framework for Technology Policy, and by doing deep dives into specific technology areas. So CNAS has a supply chain resilience initiative, and we're also working on a whole range of semiconductor-related issues as well. So how the relevant players in the global semiconductor industry can better work together to address some of the considerable supply chain vulnerabilities there. So happy to follow up with anyone offline on these issues. You can just reach out to me via the CNAS website or through social media. So, but I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with all of you. So thank you.
Thank you, Martijn. And Trisha, thoughts from you?
Sure. So cooperation amongst the Quad will continue to be an area of research at ORF. So the Quad Tech Network is part of that. We have actually released a more expansive version of the 5G piece of the paper, which is a survey of 18 countries, their 5G strategies, what they're doing in the space, if they have, say, Huawei equipment in their 3G and 4G networks. And so it's this big tent survey of all of these countries, really expanding on that idea. We've also looked at AI governance issues broadly. So ORF is a partner of the International Congress on the Governance of AI. And our efforts there actually kind of linked to the question that we were addressing before this about precedents for multilateral tech cooperation. I would say there are none, because tech collaboration is no longer expected to be just multilateral. It's multi-stakeholder, and it involves a lot more actors now than previous precedents have dictated. There's a broader role for Africa, for Latin America, for emerging Asia in these regimes. And so what will come out of it is not going to look anything like what has come before this. And then another exciting area we're looking at is building an ethical framework for quantum technologies, which is again part of some of our quad research work, which is actually under the Australian government's AI CCTP grant, part of their new cyber and critical tech program. So all of these are things to look out for in the coming year.
Perfect. Thank you, Trisha. We'll look forward to that. And thank you again both so much for taking the time. This has really been a fascinating conversation. So thank you. Thank you to everyone in the audience for questions that you've shared. And I'll turn now quickly just to next steps of what we have coming up from the Cyber Policy Center. And I saw there were a couple questions about Trisha, if you could add some links to reports and so forth in the chat box. So if you don't mind adding those for the audience, that would be great. And then next up, we have from the Cyber Policy Center a conversation with Nicole Roth, who is a journalist at the New York Times, who has worked extensively with David Sanger and other leading tech journalists there. Her new book, This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends. She'll be in conversation with our colleague Andy Grotto at the Cyber Policy Center, who leads the Center on Global Tech Governance there. And that'll be Wednesday, May 26th at 10 a.m. So join us for that if you are able. And meanwhile, thank you again, everyone, for your time and really appreciated the conversation.